The Art of Shivering Under Thatch. Hey guys, welcome back. Before we get into the frost-bitten reality of the 14th century, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket. You're definitely going to want one for this. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a time when central heating was just a pile of damp logs in the middle of a room, and your primary insulation was a very confused goat. We're going to talk about how people actually survived and occasionally slept during those brutal medieval winters. It's going to be slow, it's going to be cold, and honestly, it's going to be a bit of a disaster. So just settle in, let my voice carry you away, and let's be glad we have double-pane glass and synthetic fleece. Let's start with the house itself, if you can even call it that. Imagine, if you will, a peasant hut in the year 1320. It's called a cruck house, which sounds like something a hobbit would live in, but with significantly more mud and significantly fewer snacks. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which is essentially a fancy way of saying sticks glued together with cow manure and straw. Because, of course, when the winds are howling off the North Sea, the first thing you want between you and the void is a layer of dried excrement. It's actually surprisingly effective at blocking drafts, provided you don't think too hard about the chemical composition of your wallpaper. Now, there are no windows. Glass was for the elites, the people who spent their days arguing about papal decrees and their nights sleeping in actual beds. You had a hole in the wall with a wooden shutter. If you closed it, you were in pitch darkness. If you opened it, you were essentially inviting the Ice Age into your living room. Most people chose the darkness. It smelled like wet wool, wood smoke, and the aforementioned cow manure walls, but at least your toes weren't falling off, usually. The floor was just earth, hard-packed dirt covered in rushes. These rushes were the medieval version of a carpet, except instead of hiding crumbs, they hid a microscopic ecosystem of fleas, lice, and the occasional dropped bit of turnip. They didn't really clean the floor, they just threw more rushes on top of the old ones. It's a very out-of-sight, out-of-mind philosophy that works quite well until the bottom layer starts to ferment. But let's talk about the center of the universe, the hearth. This wasn't a cozy fireplace with a mantelpiece for your Christmas cards. It was just a stone-lined pit in the middle of the room. There was no chimney. Let's just sit with that for a moment. No chimney. The smoke would just sort of wander around the room, contemplating its existence, before eventually seeping out through the thatch in the roof. This meant that if you were standing up, you were essentially being smoked like a piece of back bacon. Most social life happened at a height of about 3 feet off the ground, because that was the only place you could actually breathe. When the sun went down, which in a northern winter is about 3:30 in the afternoon, the real challenge began. You couldn't just turn on a lamp. Tallow candles were expensive, and they smelled like a burning butcher shop because they were made of rendered animal fat. Most people used rushlights, which were just dried reeds dipped in grease. They flickered, they hissed, and they provided just enough light to see that you were, in fact, still cold. So, how do you actually sleep when the temperature inside is hovering around refrigerator levels? Well, you didn't sleep alone. Privacy is a modern invention, a luxury we took for granted the moment we stopped needing to huddle for warmth. In a medieval hut, you slept with everyone, and I mean everyone. Your spouse, your 7 children, your elderly aunt, and, because the livestock was the most expensive thing you owned, the family cow. The cow would be brought into the byre end of the house. There was usually just a low partition, or sometimes nothing at all, between the humans and the animals. From a thermal perspective, this was genius. A cow is essentially a 1,200-pound space heater that runs on grass. The downside, of course, is that a cow is also a 1,200-pound source of noise, smells, and very large, very frequent deposits. But when it's 30 degrees below freezing outside, you stop being judgmental about the personal hygiene of your roommates. You just appreciate the 4-legged radiator in the corner. Let's float over to the bedding situation.
If you were a peasant, you didn't have a mattress. You had a tick, which was a large burlap sack stuffed with straw or chaff. Straw is actually a great insulator, but it has a habit of flattening out and becoming quite stabby. It's also the preferred penthouse suite for every rodent in a 5-mile radius. You would spend the night listening to the rustle of straw, wondering if that particular movement was your toddler shifting or a field mouse looking for a snack. For blankets, you had your copes or cloaks. These were heavy, undyed wool. Wool is a miracle fabric. It stays warm even when it's damp, which was lucky because in a medieval hut, everything was always damp. The thatch leaked, the walls sweated, and the breath of 12 people and a cow created a constant mist. You'd wrap yourself in this heavy, scratchy wool, pull the communal coverlet over the whole family, and just wait for morning. There was a certain rhythm to it, the first sleep and the second sleep. You'd drift off early, sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight when the fire started to die down. This was the time for quiet reflection, or more likely the time for someone to get up, shivering, and throw another log on the embers. You'd check the animals, maybe have a bit of stale bread, and then settle back down for the second half of the night. It wasn't exactly a spa retreat. You'd wake up with a layer of soot on your face from the smoke. Your joints would ache from the cold and the hard floor. But you were alive. You had survived another night in the Little Ice Age. And as you looked over at the cow, who was also looking at you with a mix of boredom and judgment, you'd realize that as long as the thatch held and the fire kept smoldering, you were doing all right. But the winter didn't just stay outside. It lived in your bones. It lived in the way the wood of the hut would groan and crack in the deep frost, a sound like a gunshot in the middle of the silent night. Let's drift a little further into the dark and look at what happened when the gentle cold turned into a real historic freeze.
The frost in the stone and the huddled masses. So, we've established that the peasants were essentially living in a giant heated compost pile. But you might be thinking, surely it was better for the elites. Surely if you were a duke or a minor countess, you were toasty and warm in your stone castle. Well, not exactly. In fact, in many ways, being rich in the winter of the 1300s just meant you had a much larger, much more expensive refrigerator to live in. Stone is an incredible material for keeping out an invading army, but it is also a world-class conductor of cold. Once those massive granite walls lost their heat in November, they stayed cold until May. It was like living inside a mountain that hated you. While the peasants had their cow-powered central heating, the royals had tapestries. We see these in museums now and think they're just pretty art, but they were actually the medieval version of bubble wrap. They were hung a few inches away from the stone walls to create a pocket of air, trying to stop the literal frost from forming on the inside of the bedroom. Because yes, it was common for a king to wake up and find his wine had frozen solid in the cup right next to his bed. Imagine being the most powerful person in the land and you can't even have a morning drink because it's turned into a grape-flavored popsicle. The sleepless historian vibe really kicks in when you look at the fashion of the time. This wasn't about looking good, it was about survival. These people were wearing layers of fur that would make a modern animal rights activist faint. We're talking fur-lined robes, fur-lined hats, and even fur-lined underwear, because why not? If you're a royal, you might as well be a very fancy, very grumpy bear. They would sit around these massive fireplaces that were so poorly designed that 90% of the heat went straight up the chimney, while the front of your body was roasting and your back was literally developing frostbite. It was a constant slow-motion rotation, like a human rotisserie chicken, trying to keep your internal temperature somewhere above thawing. The architecture of the shiver. The wooden huts of the commoners were, ironically, often warmer than the grand halls of the lords. A hut was small, contained, and easy to heat with a single fire. A castle's great hall, however, was a cavernous nightmare. High ceilings are great for feeling important, but they're terrible for staying warm, as heat,
following the laws of physics that even kings couldn't decree away, immediately fled to the rafters, where only the bats could enjoy it. To cope, people lived in what we might call microclimates. They didn't try to heat the room, they heated the person. This is where the four-poster bed comes in. It wasn't just for privacy or to look regal. Those heavy velvet curtains were designed to be pulled shut, creating a tiny, humid tent where the body heat of 2 or 3 people could actually keep the air breathable. Inside that little velvet box, life was okay. But the moment you had to step out to use the chamber pot, which, by the way, was usually just a cold ceramic bowl, you were re-entering the Arctic. Let's talk about the hygiene of the winter, or lack thereof. If you think the wet wool and manure smell of the peasant hut was bad, the castle wasn't much better. People simply didn't wash in the winter. Water was either frozen or required a massive amount of firewood to heat, and nobody was going to waste precious fuel just to smell like lavender. So everyone just accumulated layers of soot, sweat, and grease. It was a very communal, very pungent experience. You just sort of accepted that everyone you loved smelled like a damp campfire. The social hierarchy of warmth. In the huts, the social hierarchy was determined by who got to sleep closest to the fire and the cow. Usually, the patriarch or the person doing the heaviest labor got the hot spot. The children were often piled together like a litter of puppies at the edge of the straw. There's a certain tragic irony in it. The more children you had, the more biological heaters you had in the bed. It was a grim sort of math. But what did they do all day? You couldn't farm. The ground was like iron. You couldn't travel because the paths were waist-deep in snow or treacherous ice. So you sat. You mended tools by the dim light of a rushlight. You told stories. This is where the boring part of history really shines. It was weeks of sitting in a smoky room, eating the same salted pork and dried peas, waiting for the world to turn green again. There was a lot of staring at walls, a lot of listening to the wind whistle through the thatch. And the diet? Oh, it was a delight if you enjoy scurvy. By February, any fresh vegetables were a distant memory. You were eating pottage, which is a fancy word for a thick gray sludge made of grains, leeks, and whatever else hadn't rotted in the cellar yet. If you were a peasant, you were constantly on the edge of the hunger. If the previous harvest had been bad, the winter wasn't just cold, it was a slow, quiet battle against starvation. You'd sleep more simply because your body didn't have the calories to do anything else. The weirdness of winter entertainment. When they weren't shivering or eating gray sludge, medieval people had some truly strange ways of passing the time. In the royal courts, they would sometimes hold ice feasts if a nearby river froze over. They would literally move the party onto the ice, because apparently the castle wasn't cold enough, so they decided to go stand on a frozen river for fun. But for the person in the wooden hut, entertainment was simpler. It was gossip. It was the dry humor of the era, joking about whose pig was the skinniest, or which neighbor's thatch was most likely to collapse. There was a stoicism to it, a sense that yes, this is miserable, but at least we aren't dead yet. That was the baseline for a successful Tuesday. As the night deepens and the fire in our imaginary hut flickers low, you can almost feel the weight of those wool blankets. You can hear the rhythmic breathing of the family, the occasional rustle of the straw, and the distant howl of a wolf that's just as cold as you are. It's a slow, heavy existence. No TikTok, no podcasts, just the sound of your own heart and the crackle of a damp log. Let's float away from the peasant huts for a moment and look at the monks. If anyone had it worse, it was the monks. They had to get up in the middle of the night, the nocturnes, to go into a stone chapel and sing. No heaters, no furs, usually, just their wool habits and a lot of faith. They wrote about the ink freezing in their pens as they tried to copy manuscripts. They would have to stop writing because their fingers simply stopped working. There's something beautifully quiet about that. A monk sitting in a silent scriptorium, blowing on his fingers, waiting for the sun to rise just enough to melt his ink. So, as you lay there in your temperature-controlled room, maybe give a quick thought to our ancestors. They were tough, they were smelly, and they were experts at the art of the long, cold huddle. They knew how to stretch a single candle for a week and how to find comfort in the warmth of a nearby cow. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't aesthetic, but it worked. The winter eventually ends. The ice on the wine cup melts. The cow goes back out to the pasture, and the cycle starts all over again. But for now, in the heart of the frost, everyone is just trying to find that one pocket of air that isn't freezing. Sleep well knowing that your walls aren't made of manure and your roommates don't have hooves. Unless they do, in which case I hope they're at least good heaters.
The royal chills and the anatomy of a castle winter. Hey again, I'm glad you're still with me. If you haven't drifted off yet, let's sink a little deeper into the cushions and move away from the peasant huts for a while. Let's talk about the people who supposedly had it all, the kings, the queens, and the high nobility, and how they spent their winters essentially cosplaying as frozen statues in their own homes. Because, as it turns out, having a crown doesn't actually make your blood run any warmer. In fact, if you were a medieval royal, your life in winter was a very specific kind of gilded misery. Imagine you were queen in the late 1300s. You live in a castle that is a masterpiece of military engineering. It has battlements, it has a moat, and it has walls so thick they could withstand a catapult barrage. But those walls are also sucking the soul out of every fire you light. You're sitting in the Great Hall, which is about the size of a modern aircraft hangar, and you're wearing 5 layers of silk and fur. You look like a very expensive, very angry laundry pile, and despite all that, you can still see your breath misting in front of your face as you try to eat a piece of venison that is rapidly turning into a meat-flavored ice cube. The Great Fireplace Fallacy. The elites had these massive, cavernous fireplaces. You've seen them. They're large enough to roast an entire ox. And they did roast oxen in them, which is great if you're a fan of excessive protein. But as a heating system, they were a total disaster. Because the chimneys were so wide, they created a massive updraft. This meant that while the fire was roaring, it was actually pulling cold air in through every crack in the windows and doors to feed the flames. So if you were sitting by the fire, your front was being singed and your back was being hit by a localized blizzard coming through the door. It was a constant losing battle. There's an account of a royal dinner where the king's beard actually caught a stray spark while his wine flagon, sitting just a foot away on the table, was developing a thin crust of ice. That is the kind of ironic contrast that the medieval period excelled at. You were simultaneously on fire and freezing to death. The bedchamber, a velvet survival pod. Now, we think of these as romantic or royal, but in reality, they were survival pods. These beds were massive, and they were surrounded by heavy, thick wool or velvet curtains. At night, the royal couple would climb in, often with a few pet dogs for extra heat, and the servants would pull the curtains shut. Inside that little box, the air would eventually warm up from the collective body heat. It was humid, it was probably a bit stale, and it definitely smelled like wet spaniel, but it was 30 degrees warmer than the rest of the room. The tragedy, of course, was the morning. Imagine being the personal valet who had to open those curtains at 6 a.m. You're essentially popping a heat bubble and letting the Arctic in. The king would have to be coaxed out of bed like a hibernating bear, and honestly, can you blame him? I'd probably declare war on a neighboring country just for an extra hour under the furs. The fashion of desperation. Let's talk about the look of the season. If you were a nobleman, you wore something called a houppelande. It was basically a giant floor-length dressing gown made of heavy wool and lined entirely with the fur of hundreds of squirrels or sables. The sleeves were so long and wide they often hit the floor. Why? Because you could tuck your hands deep inside them like a built-in muff. Even the shoes were ridiculous. They had these long, pointed toes called krakows. In winter, they would often be stuffed with moss or extra wool to keep the toes from falling off. It wasn't about being chic. It was about not losing a digit to the draft coming off the flagstone floors. And the hats. Everyone wore hats indoors, huge padded hoods or turbans. If you took your hat off in a medieval castle in January, you were basically asking for a sinus infection that would last until the Crusades. The hygiene of the elite.
Now, you might wonder about the bathing habits of the rich during a freeze. The short answer is they didn't. In the summer, a king might enjoy a nice soak in a wooden tub filled with rose petals. In the winter, that tub would be a giant block of ice before the king even got his boots off. Instead, they practiced what we call dry washing. They would rub their skin with white linen cloths to wick away the oils. They would use heavy perfumes, musk, ambergris, rosewater, to mask the fact that they hadn't seen a bar of soap since the leaves fell off the trees. It was a very layered smell, expensive perfume on top, wood smoke in the middle, and unwashed human at the base. It's the kind of scent profile that would make a modern candle maker cry, but back then it was just the smell of status. The boredom of the long night. What did they do all day? There were no hunts. The horses would slip on the ice. There was no gardening. There was just sitting. They played a lot of chess. They played a lot of tables, an early version of backgammon, and they listened to minstrels. Imagine being a court minstrel. You have to play the lute while your fingers are numb. You have to sing songs about chivalry and spring while you're wearing 3 cloaks and standing in a drafty corner. The songs were always about the merry month of May or the greenwood tree, which was essentially a form of medieval psychological coping. They were singing about the sun because they couldn't remember what it felt like. And the food. By January, the fresh meat was gone. Everything was salted, pickled, or dried. The royal chefs would try to hide the taste of the old meat with massive amounts of spices, cinnamon, ginger, pepper, which were incredibly expensive. So being rich meant your old salty beef tasted like a gingerbread cookie. It was a strange, spicy, monotonous diet that probably didn't help with the general grumpiness of the court. And the silent monks and the frozen ink. Let's float away from the palace for a moment and visit the monasteries. If the kings were miserable, the monks were on a whole other level. They didn't have the fur-lined robes and the velvet beds. They had thin wool habits and stone cells. There were actual notes in the margins of medieval manuscripts where the monks would complain about the weather. One monk wrote, "The ink is thin, the parchment is cold, and my hand is stiff." Another just wrote, "God, it is cold." You can feel the humanity in those words. They were trying to preserve the knowledge of the world while their literal tools were freezing in their hands. They would have to keep the inkwells near the small fires just to keep the liquid from turning into a pebble. The winter meltdowns. When you combine the cold, the darkness, the lack of fresh food, and the fact that you're trapped in a stone box with the same 50 people for 4 months, you get what I like to call castle fever. The records are full of royal family members losing their minds during the winter. Arguments over who sat where, who looked at whom, or who stole the extra blanket would escalate into full-blown political crises. There was a lot of weeping, a lot of dramatic exits into the snow, and a lot of very petty letters written to the Pope. It was basically a high-stakes soap opera where everyone is wearing too much fur and everyone is slightly hungry. But then, eventually, the thaw would come. You'd hear the sound of the ice cracking in the moat, a sound like a thunderclap. The sleepless historian in me loves that moment, the collective sigh of relief as the first green shoots appeared and the king could finally take off his 3rd hat. The medieval winter wasn't just a season, it was an endurance test. It was a time when the world slowed down to a crawl, and the only thing that mattered was the hearth and the person huddling next to you. It was quiet, it was dark, and it was incredibly, incredibly slow. So as you lay there, tucked into your modern bed, feel the warmth of your room. Think about the king in his velvet box, the peasant with his cow, and the monk with his frozen ink. The world has changed, but the winter is still the old cold.
The frozen Thames and the carnival of the shivering. Hey again, you're still awake? That's okay. Just settle back down, let your shoulders drop, and let's drift into a world where the water itself turned into a city. If you thought the medieval castle was a cold stone refrigerator, wait until we talk about what happened when the climate decided to go completely off the rails during the Little Ice Age.
Specifically, let's talk about the great frosts of London and the surreal, icy chaos of the Thames frost fairs. Because, as it turns out, when humans are faced with a frozen river and a terrifyingly long winter, their first instinct is apparently to set up a pub on the ice and start racing goats. Imagine it's the winter of 1683. The temperature has dropped so low that the River Thames, a massive, rushing, tidal river, has frozen solid. And I don't mean a thin sheet of ice that cracks when a duck lands on it. I mean a block of ice nearly a foot thick. It was so solid that the people of London, who were currently freezing in their drafty timber houses, looked at the river and thought, well, there's plenty of real estate out there. The city on the ice. Suddenly, the river wasn't a barrier, it was a playground. They built entire streets of shops on the ice. They called it Freezeland because, of course, 17th century humor was just as dry and literal as ours. There were rows of booths selling everything from hot gingerbread to roasted ox. They even had a printing press out there. People would pay a few pennies to have their names printed on a piece of paper that said, "I stood on the frozen Thames," which is essentially the 1600s version of checking in on Facebook. The sleepless historian vibe here is really in the irony of it all. People were literally dying of cold in the city streets, yet just a few hundred yards away, the wealthy were sliding around in horse-drawn carriages on the river, drinking hot punch and watching puppet shows. It was a bizarre, slow-motion carnival of the desperate and the bored. The king himself, Charles II, who was never one to miss a party, even if it involved a risk of drowning in liquid nitrogen, would take his entire court out onto the ice. They'd go for a stroll, their heavy silk robes dragging across the frozen surface, looking for all the world like a group of very confused, very fancy penguins. They even roasted a whole ox over a fire built directly on the ice. Think about the physics of that for a second. You're building a fire to cook a cow on the very thing that is keeping you from sinking into a freezing abyss. It's the ultimate medieval because why not moment. The sounds of the deep freeze. When you're lying there tonight, try to imagine the sound of that winter. It wasn't silent. When the ice is that thick, it groans. It makes these deep booming sounds that echo off the stone buildings of London like cannon fire. It's the sound of the earth shifting under the weight of the cold. At night, the frost fair would grow quiet. The fires would dim to glowing embers on the ice. The shopkeepers would huddle in their temporary wooden stalls, listening to the river breathe beneath them. It's a haunting thought. Thousands of people sleeping on a frozen river, trusting that the temperature won't rise just 2 degrees and send them all for a very sudden, very cold swim. But for the most part, the ice held. It held for weeks. It held for months. It became its own ecosystem. There were football matches, horse races, and even ice skating using polished animal bones strapped to the bottom of boots. Imagine the clatter of bone on ice, the muffled shouts of the crowd, and the constant bitter wind whipping through the stalls. It was a life lived in the extreme, but lived with a weird, stubborn cheerfulness. The tragedy of the thaw. Of course, all things must end, and the thaw was usually more dangerous than the freeze. When the temperature finally broke, it didn't happen gently. The ice would begin to crack with a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once. Huge chunks of ice, some the size of houses, would break off and go crashing into the piers of London Bridge. The people on the river had to scramble. You'd see shopkeepers frantically dragging their wooden booths toward the shore as the ground literally liquefied beneath them. There are stories of people losing everything, their stock, their stalls, their livelihood, to the river in a matter of minutes. One day it was a bustling city of ice, the next it was a chaotic mess of floating timber and drowning goats. And then the river would return to just being a river. The great frost would pass into legend, and the people would go back to their damp, drafty houses to wait for the next time the world turned white. The long, cold silence of the countryside. But let's float away from the noise of London and go back to the rural silence. While the city was having its frozen carnival, the countryside was a graveyard of silence. Birds would literally freeze mid-flight and fall from the sky. Sheep would be found huddled together in the lee of a stone wall, turned into woolly statues. For the village priest or the local healer, the winter was a time of constant, quiet labor. You'd be called out in the middle of the night to visit a dying parishioner, walking through snow that reached your waist. Your lantern would flicker in the wind, and the only thing keeping you moving would be the thought of the small, smoky fire waiting back at the rectory. The sleepless historian in me thinks about the psychological toll of that kind of winter, the way the horizon disappears, the way the world shrinks down to the four walls of your house and the small circle of light from a single candle. It's no wonder their folk tales are so dark, filled with ice queens and frost giants. They weren't just stories, they were a way to give a name to the thing that was trying to kill them every January. As we settle into the final stretch of our journey tonight, let's look at the huddle one more time. It's the most human thing about the medieval winter. In the face of a cold that could shatter stone, people chose each other. They chose the warmth of their families, the warmth of their neighbors, and yes, even the warmth of their cows. They shared the last of the salted pork, they shared the last of the firewood, and they told the same stories over and over until the words became as familiar as the rhythm of their own breathing. There is something deeply comforting about that, the idea that even in the darkest, coldest part of human history, we found a way to stay warm together. So, as the lights in your house stay steady and the heater hums in the background, take a deep breath. Feel the stillness of the air. You don't have to worry about the ice cracking under your feet or the wine freezing in your cup. You are safe in the future, looking back at a time when surviving a Tuesday was a feat of heroic proportions. The history of winter is a history of endurance. It's a history of people who refused to let the fire go out, no matter how hard the wind blew. It's slow, it's quiet, and it's finally time to let it go. The Thames is flowing again, the huts are warm, the monks have put down their frozen pens, and you are finally ready to drift off. The stories will be here when you wake up, but for now, the world is silent. The frost is just a memory. Sleep well. Good night.
The year without a summer and the birth of monsters. If you're still drifting with me, we've moved past the medieval huts and the frozen Thames. We're floating forward in time now, to a year that felt like a glitch in the universe. It was 1816, a year known to history as 1800 and froze to death, or more formally, the year without a summer. And if you think a normal winter is bad, imagine a winter that simply refuses to leave, even when the calendar says it's July. Imagine waking up in the middle of June and seeing a thick blanket of snow covering your vegetable garden. It's the kind of environmental gaslighting that changes a culture forever. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets, let's talk about the cold that came from a volcano and the strange, dark art it inspired. Because when the sun goes out, humans get very, very creative and a little bit weird. The ghost of Mount Tambora. The whole thing started on the other side of the world, in Indonesia. A volcano called Mount Tambora decided to have the most violent eruption in recorded history. It wasn't just a bit of smoke, it was a cataclysm.
It threw so much ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere that it basically formed a giant planetary parasol. It dimmed the sun. For the next year, the world lived in a perpetual hazy twilight. In Europe and North America, the spring of 1816 never really arrived. People were waiting for the thaw, waiting for the birds to sing, but the birds were falling dead from the trees because there were no insects to eat. The ground remained frozen. In New England, they had yellow snow, snow that was stained with volcanic ash, looking like something from a nightmare. Imagine the sleepless historian irony here. The Industrial Revolution was just getting started. People were dreaming of progress and light, and suddenly the atmosphere turns into a cold gray soup. It was a global atmospheric no. Let's float over to Switzerland, specifically to a place called Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. This is where the literary world's most famous staycation took place. You had Lord Byron, who was essentially the 19th century version of a chaotic rock star, Mary Shelley, her husband Percy, and a few others. They had gone to the Swiss Alps for a lovely summer holiday of hiking and boating. Instead, they got trapped inside. For days on end, the rain was relentless. It was dark, it was freezing, and the wind was howling off the lake like a wounded animal. They couldn't go outside without being drenched in freezing slush. So, what do a bunch of bored, highly educated, and slightly dramatic poets do when they're trapped in a cold house during a volcanic winter? They start a ghost story competition. Mary Shelley sat there, listening to the thunder and the scratching of the tree branches against the window. The cold was seeped into the very floorboards. She had a waking dream, a vision of a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the things she had put together. And thus Frankenstein was born. It wasn't born in a sunny laboratory. It was born in the shivering, claustrophobic darkness of a summer that felt like the end of the world. Think about that for a second. One of the most famous monsters in history exists because a volcano in Indonesia made it too cold for a group of teenagers to go for a walk in Switzerland. That is the kind of butterfly effect that makes history so wonderfully quietly absurd. The Hunger and the Huddle, Part 2. While the poets were writing masterpieces, the rest of the world was just trying not to starve. This was the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. Because the crops wouldn't grow, the price of oats and grain skyrocketed. In Ireland, the potatoes rotted in the ground. In Germany, people were eating famine bread made of sawdust and straw. The huddle returned, but this time it was grimmer. It wasn't the communal warmth of the medieval hut. It was a desperate, hungry huddle. People traveled in search of food, their footsteps silent in the unseasonal snow. There were riots, of course, but mostly there was just a heavy, cold silence. The social fibers started to fray. When nature stops behaving, people stop believing in the order of things. If the sun doesn't come out in July, what else might go wrong? There was a sense of impending doom, a feeling that the world was winding down like a clock that had lost its key. The invention of the bicycle, seriously. In the middle of all this misery, there's a strange little spark of human ingenuity. Because the crops failed, there was no grain to feed the horses, and because there were no horses, people couldn't get around. A German inventor named Karl von Drais looked at the starving horses and the empty grain bins and thought, what if I made a horse out of wood that doesn't need to eat? He invented the Lauf machine, or running machine, the ancestor of the modern bicycle. It was basically a wooden frame with two wheels that you pushed with your feet. It looked ridiculous, especially since the people riding it usually had on heavy winter coats in the middle of August. But it worked. The bicycle is, in a very real way, a product of a volcanic winter. We ride bikes today because 200 years ago it was too cold to grow horse food. The long twilight. As the year dragged on, the atmosphere slowly started to clear, but the psychological mark remained. The art of this period changed. Painters like J.M.W. Turner began painting these wild, blood-red sunsets and hazy, diffuse landscapes. They weren't just being artistic, they were literally painting the volcanic ash in the air. The sky had changed color, and the human eye was trying to make sense of it. Eventually, 1817 arrived, and the sun finally managed to burn through the haze. The crops grew again. The snow melted in July. The world went back to normal, or at least the new normal. But for the people who lived through it, the year without a summer was a reminder of how fragile we really are. One mountain on the other side of the planet clears its throat, and we're all back in the dark, shivering under our blankets, wondering if the sun is ever coming back. The fade into sleep. So, as you lie there, feel the weight of your own summer or winter. The world outside your window is predictable. The sun follows its path, the seasons behave, and you have the luxury of being bored by the weather rather than terrified by it. Think of Mary Shelley dipping her pen into the ink in that drafty Swiss villa, creating a monster to fill the void of the long, dark days. Think of the German inventor on his wooden wheels, gliding over the frozen mud of a summer that wasn't. We are a resilient species, aren't we? We take the cold, we take the darkness, and we turn it into stories and inventions. The volcano has long since gone quiet. The ash has settled into the soil. The world is warm, or at least warm enough. The monsters are just characters in books now, and the bicycle is just a way to get to the park. Let the history of the cold wrap around you like a heavy wool cloak. It's a shield against the noise of the modern world. Everything is still. Everything is quiet. The long year is over, and it's finally time to close your eyes. The story is done for tonight. The frost is gone. The sun, our real sun, will be there in the morning. Sleep well. Good night.
The Victorian ice obsession and the tragedy of the Franklin expedition. Hey there! If you're still awake, drifting in that space between the warmth of your sheets and the cold facts of history, let's travel into the 1840s. We're moving into an era where the cold wasn't just something to be endured in a hut. It became a frontier. The Victorians had a very strange, very intense relationship with the Arctic. They viewed the ice as a personal challenge, a massive frozen puzzle that they were determined to solve with nothing but steam engines, wool peacoats, and an incredible amount of canned soup. Tonight, let's talk about the ultimate cold story, Sir John Franklin's lost expedition. It's a tale of iron ships, extreme hubris, and the slow, silent realization that the ice always wins. So adjust your pillow, make sure your feet are tucked in, and let's head north, where the sun disappears for months and the only sound is the grinding of the pack ice. The hubris of iron and steam. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set off to find the Northwest Passage. This was the holy grail of navigation, a shortcut through the Arctic to the Pacific. He didn't go in light. He took two massive ships, the Erebus and the Terror. These weren't just boots, they were floating Victorian drawing rooms. They had libraries with thousands of books, fine china, silver cutlery, and even a primitive form of central heating. Franklin was convinced that British technology could conquer the cold. They had 3 years' worth of food, including thousands of tins of meat and vegetables. They were so confident that they didn't really bother to learn from the Inuit people who had lived in that cold for thousands of years. The Inuit knew how to hunt seal, how to build igloos, and how to move with the ice.
The British, however, brought a library and a piano, because, of course, when you're trapped in a frozen wasteland, the first thing you need is a rousing rendition of a sea shanty. The long white silence. For the first year, everything seemed fine, but then the ice did what the ice does. It closed in. Near King William Island, the Erebus and the Terror became beset, which is a polite nautical term for being completely stuck in a giant ice cube. Imagine the sleepless historian vibe of that first winter. The ships were trapped, but the men weren't worried yet. They had their books, they had their theater productions on deck, they had their silver spoons. They lived in a weird artificial bubble of Victorian civilization while the Arctic winter roared outside. The sun vanished in November and didn't come back for months. They spent their days in the dim glow of oil lamps, the hulls of the ships creaking and groaning as the ice squeezed them. It was slow, it was monotonous, it was the ultimate test of patience. They played board games, they held evening schools to teach the sailors to read, and they waited for the summer thaw. But the summer of 1846 never really came. The ice didn't melt. Then 1847 came, and the ice still didn't melt. The slow unraveling. This is where the story gets dark, but in a very quiet, cold way. The central heating failed. The tinned food, which had been soldered with lead, started to slowly poison the crew. Lead poisoning makes you confused, paranoid, and weak. So you have 129 men trapped in a frozen box, slowly losing their minds, while their gums bled from scurvy and the temperature stayed at 40 degrees below zero. There was no drama, there were no explosions, there was just the sound of the wind and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clocks on the wall. They waited for 3 years. 3 years of looking out the porthole at a world that was nothing but white and gray. In 1848, the survivors finally abandoned the ships. They decided to walk. Now, think about the absurdity of this. These men were so wedded to their Victorian lifestyle that they tried to drag heavy sledges across the jagged ice, loaded down with necessities like silver plate, silk handkerchiefs, and heavy writing desks. They were literally dragging the weight of their own culture across the Arctic, and it was killing them. The ghostly footsteps. The Inuit hunters later reported seeing white men walking through the snow. They described them as looking like ghosts, thin, pale, and stumbling. One by one, the men lay down in the snow and simply stopped moving. The cold is a very gentle killer in that way. It makes you sleepy. It makes you feel warm right before you drift off for the last time. For decades, the Franklin expedition was a mystery. It became a Victorian obsession. They sent dozens of search parties. They turned Franklin's wife, Lady Jane, into a national symbol of the waiting widow. It was a tragedy that defined an era. It showed the limits of the industrial age. You could build the strongest steamship in the world, but the ice didn't care about your steam engine. The ice didn't care about your library. The modern discovery. It wasn't until 2014 and 2016 that the wrecks of the Erebus and the Terror were finally found, sitting perfectly preserved in the cold, dark waters of the Arctic. They look like ghost ships, their masts still standing, their plates still stacked in the cupboards. They are time capsules of a winter that never ended. When you think about the Franklin men, don't think of them as heroes or explorers. Think of them as people who were very, very cold. Think of them huddled in their bunks, listening to the ice, wishing they were back in a damp, smoky London pub. Their story is a reminder of how much we rely on the thin veneer of our technology to keep the outside away. The comfort of the present. Let's drift back to your room now. Feel the weight of your blankets. Notice that you don't have to worry about lead-poisoned soup or dragging a silver tea service across a glacier. Your heater is clicking, your world is stable, and the ice is safely tucked away in your freezer. The Victorians were obsessed with the Arctic because it was the ultimate blank space. It was a place of purity and terror. But for us, tonight, it's just a story to help us settle into the dark. The ships are at the bottom of the sea, the explorers are at rest, and the long white silence has been replaced by the soft hum of your own life. The Arctic is a beautiful, terrifying place, but it's far away. The only beset you are tonight is by the comfort of your own bed. Let the image of the white, silent snow fade away. Replace it with the warmth of a fire or the soft glow of a nightlight. The journey is over. The ships have been found. The mystery is solved. Sleep now. The frost won't reach you here. Good night.
The Night Watchman and the Russian Winter of Wonders. If you're still hovering on the edge of sleep, you've made it further than most. We've survived the peasant huts, the frozen Thames, and the tragic iron ships of the Arctic. Now, let's float into a different kind of cold, the deep, rhythmic, and strangely beautiful winter of the Russian Empire and the life of those whose job it was to stay awake while the world turned to glass. We're going to talk about the Night Watchman, the winter palaces, and the absolute madness of the 1740 Ice Palace of St. Petersburg. So, sink a little deeper. Let the weight of your blankets mimic the heavy furs of its Tsarist winter. We are going to a place where the cold isn't just a season, it's a national identity, the guardian of the embers. Imagine you are a night watchman in a small Russian village in the 18th century. Your job is simple, yet grueling. You walk. You walk the perimeter of the wooden houses, carrying a heavy wooden rattle or a bell. You aren't just looking for thieves, you are looking for the red rooster, fire. In a world made of dried timber and straw, where every house has a massive stone stove burning all night, fire is the only thing more terrifying than the frost. As you walk, the snow crunches under your boots with a sound like breaking bone. It's so cold that the moisture in your breath freezes instantly into your beard, turning you into a literal ice sculpture. You wear a tulipun, a massive sheepskin coat that weighs nearly 30 pounds. It smells of lanolin, old wood smoke, and sweat. But inside that coat, you are a tiny walking tropical island. The snarky historical aside here is that the watchman is the only one awake to see the beauty of the winter. He sees the aurora borealis dancing over the birch trees, colors that look like spilled ink in a dark basin. He sees the diamond dust, tiny ice crystals floating in the air that catch the moonlight and make the world look like it's been dipped in crushed jewels. It's a silent, lonely, breathtaking world, and his only companion is the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The stove, the heart of the Russian soul. Inside the houses the watchman passes, the families are engaged in the ultimate Russian winter tradition, sleeping on the stove. This wasn't a little campfire. The pech was a massive masonry stove that took up a third of the room. It had flat platforms built on top of the warm bricks. The most vulnerable, the elderly and the children, would sleep directly on top of the stove. The heat was deep, dry, and constant. It seeped into your bones and stayed there. There's a beautiful, slow rhythm to a house heated by a pitch. You don't just feel the warmth, you hear it in the gentle hiss of the wood and the settling of the stones. While the night watchman is shivering in the -40-degree wind, the grandmother on top of the stove is probably sweating under her wool shawl. It's a world of extremes, separated only by a few inches of log wall and a lot of dry moss. The absurdity of the Empress's ice palace. But let's float away from the village and into the surreal world of the Russian court
in St. Petersburg. In the winter of 1739-40, Empress Anna Ionovna decided to celebrate a military victory by building something that defies all logic. She ordered the construction of a palace made entirely of ice. This wasn't just a big igloo. It was a full-scale palace, 80 feet long, with windows made of thin sheets of ice furniture, an ice clock, and even an ice bed. They carved ice statues of elephants that actually squirted water, or possibly naphtha, through their trunks. They made ice trees with ice birds. The snarky historical aside here is that the Empress used this high-stakes architectural marvel as a form of high-stakes bullying. She forced one of her disgraced princes, whom she had turned into a court jester, to marry an exceptionally unattractive maid and spend their wedding night in the ice bed inside the ice palace in the middle of a Russian January. They survived because the bride had smuggled in some extra furs. Because, of course, if you're an empress with unlimited power and a very cold climate, you eventually decide to turn the weather into a weapon, the slow thaw of the mind. When you live in a climate where the sun only appears for 5 hours a day, your mind starts to work differently. The Russians developed a specific kind of winter philosophy, a mix of fatalism and deep, dark humor. They had Swatki, the period between Christmas and Epiphany, where the rules of society blurred. People would dress up in terrifying masks, visit neighbors, and tell fortunes. They believed the Morosko, or Father Frost, was a powerful, unpredictable spirit. He wasn't the jolly Santa Claus we know. He was a stern, icy figure who could freeze you solid if you were rude to him, but might give you a bag of gold if you showed proper respect. It was a way of personifying the weather, of giving the cold a face so you could bargain with it. As the night watchman completes his final round, the sky begins to turn a pale, bruised purple. The blue hour of the morning is beginning. The village is still silent. The smoke from the chimneys rises straight up, like white pillars, unmoving in the frozen air. He knows that soon the stoves will be stoked, the samovars will start to hiss, and the smell of hot rye bread will fill the huts. The gentle fade. So, as we leave the Russian watchman to his morning tea, let's return to your own space. The cold of the Russian steppe is just a story now. The Empress's ice palace has long since melted into the Neva River. The red rooster of fire stayed away, and the village is safe for another day. You are tucked into a world of controlled temperatures and electric lights. You don't have to walk the perimeter of your house with a wooden rattle. You don't have to sleep on a brick stove to stay alive. But maybe, just a little bit, you can feel that deep, dry warmth in your own limbs. Maybe you can hear the silence of the snow in the quiet moments between my words. History is a long series of cold nights, but the sun always comes up eventually. The ice palace melts, the watchman goes home to sleep, and the world turns green again. But for now, it is still the blue hour. It is still time to rest. The stories are tucked away, the fire is just embers, and the darkness is a soft, heavy blanket. The watchman has finished his rounds. He has rung his bell. The village is safe, and you are finally, truly ready to let go. Sleep well in your palace of warmth. Let the Russian winter drift away into the mist. Good night.
The silent snows of the samurai and the mountain hermits. I see you're still drifting with me in this long, frozen corridor of time. If your eyes are heavy and your mind is starting to feel like it's made of soft wool, you're exactly where you need to be. We've traveled across the European huts, the Russian steppes, and the Arctic wastes. Now, for our final chapter tonight, let's float eastward.
let's look at how the winter was met in the mountainous islands of Japan during the Edo period. It's a world of paper walls, charcoal braziers, and a deep aesthetic appreciation for the very thing that was trying to freeze you, the silence of the snow. So, adjust your blankets one last time. Imagine the smell of cedar wood and the faint, earthy scent of green tea. We're heading into a landscape where the winter wasn't fought with heavy stone or brick, but with a quiet, ritualistic endurance. The paper house and the winter wind. Imagine living in a traditional Japanese house in the year 1750. To a Westerner, this house looks like a summer pavilion. The walls are made of shoji, translucent paper stretched over wooden frames. There is no insulation. There are no thick granite walls. When the wind blows down from the Japanese Alps, it doesn't just knock at the door, it whispers through every seam in the paper. You might think this is a recipe for instant frostbite, and you'd be right. But the Japanese approach to winter wasn't to heat the house. That was seen as impossible and perhaps a bit wasteful. Instead, they heated the person. The house remained essentially at the same temperature as the garden. If it was 20 degrees outside, it was 22 degrees in your living room. The sleepless historian irony here is that the most beautiful part of the house, the view of the snow-covered bamboo, was only separated from you by a piece of paper thinner than a napkin. You lived in a state of constant visual intimacy with the cold. The kotatsu, the gravity of warmth. In the Edo period, this was a low wooden table frame placed over a hole in the floor that contained glowing charcoal embers. A heavy quilt was draped over the table, trapping the heat underneath. The entire family would sit around this table, tucking their legs under the quilt. It created a microclimate of absolute bliss for your lower half, while your shoulders were still experiencing the reality of a mountain winter. It created a very specific kind of social life. Because the heat was concentrated in one spot, everyone stayed there. You ate there, you worked there, and you told stories there. If you had to leave the kotatsu to go to the kitchen, it was treated like an Arctic expedition. You'd wrap your kimono tighter, take a deep breath, and dash into the void before scurrying back to the safety of the quilt. The samurai and the zen of shivering. Now, let's talk about the samurai. These were warriors who prided themselves on discipline and stoicism. To a samurai, complaining about the cold was practically a defeat. They had rituals of cold water purification called misogi, where they would stand under a freezing waterfall in the middle of January to toughen their spirit. But even a samurai needs to sleep. At night, they would use a kaidu, a thick, silk-padded sleeping kimono that was essentially a wearable duvet. It had sleeves, but it was so heavy and warm that you could survive in a room where the water in the wash basin had turned to a solid block of ice. They slept on tatami mats, which are made of packed straw. Much like the peasant huts of Europe, straw was the great unsung hero of the winter. It provided a tiny bit of insulation between the body and the frozen earth. There's something very sleepless historian about the image of a fierce warrior, a man who could cut a fly in half with a katana, curled up in a giant floral-patterned silk sleeping bag, trying to keep his nose from getting too cold. It's a reminder that no matter how much honor you have, your biology still wants a blanket. The snow country and the straw capes. In the northern provinces, known as the snow country, the winters were so heavy that the snow would reach the second-story eaves of the houses. People literally had to dig tunnels to get to their neighbors. To move through this world, they wore mino, rain and snow capes made of layered rice straw. When a person wore a mino and a wide straw hat, they looked like a small walking haystack. The straw was surprisingly effective. The snow would slide off the outer layers, and the inner layers would trap body heat. It was a low-tech, high-efficiency solution that had been perfected over 1,000 years. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't royal, but it kept you alive while you were shoveling 10 feet of powder off your roof. The aesthetic of the cold. What I love most about this period of history is how they turned the misery of winter into art. They had a concept called wabi-sabi, finding beauty in the imperfect and the fleeting. They wrote haikus about the sound of a charcoal ember popping in the dark. They watched the way the snow piled up on a single pine branch until it bowed low and dropped its load with a soft thump. While the Victorians were trying to conquer the Arctic with steam engines, the Japanese were sitting quietly by their charcoal braziers, writing poems about how the cold made the tea taste sweeter. It was a philosophy of surrender. You don't fight the winter, you invite it in, give it a cup of tea, and wait for it to leave on its own terms. The final fade into the mist. As we reach the end of our 1.5-hour journey through the frozen corridors of the past, I want you to feel the stillness that comes after a heavy snow. You know that sound, that muffled, absolute silence where the world feels like it's been wrapped in cotton wool? That is the sound of history resting. We've seen the fires of the medieval hearths grow dim. We've seen the frost fairs melt into the river. We've seen the volcanic ash of 1916 settle into the ground, and the samurai's charcoal turn to white ash. All of these people, across all these centuries, have gone to sleep just like you are doing now. They survived their winters, they found their warmth, and they passed the torch to us. You are the beneficiary of all that shivering. You have the warmth they dreamed of. You have the light they spent their lives trying to preserve. The story is over now. The map of the world is complete. The night watchman has gone to bed. The king is warm in his velvet box, and the mountain hermit has closed his paper door. The air in your room is perfect. Your blankets are heavy and soft. The world is safe, and the sun, whenever it decides to show up, is still millions of miles away, waiting for its cue. Let your thoughts drift away like the diamond dust in a Russian forest. Let your breath slow down to the rhythm of a sleeping village. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to hear, and nowhere left to go. You are home. You are warm. You are asleep. Good night.